Welcome to Danielle Smith's Fraser Forum. This program is part of a series of podcasts doing in-depth interviews on free enterprise and personal liberty. I'm your host, Danielle Smith, president of the Alberta Enterprise Group. Go to fraserforum.org where you can subscribe, comment on the program, and see links to the studies we discuss. You will also find archives of previous episodes. Our email address is danielle@fraserforum.org. We'd love to hear from you.
So as long as we don't import food from outer space, good quality food, the best food at any given point in time, will have to be grown somewhere on Earth. And perhaps at certain times of the year, it will be in your neighbor's backyard, or it will be, the pastures of Alberta or what have you. So I'm not against local food when people would buy it for reasons other than being local. Meaning that local food at certain times of the year gives you the best quality price ratio. Then, well, of course, I'm not against that. What I'm against is guilting people into buying local food when you pay more for lesser quality.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Danielle Smith's Fraser Forum. I'm delighted to be talking with Pierre Desrochers, who is an associate professor of geography at the University of Toronto, as well as a senior fellow with the Fraser Institute. Professor, thanks so much for being with me today.
Thanks for having me.
I want to go back and just revisit the first time I saw you speak. And I told you I would do this because every time I talk to you, I'd love to tell this story because you were so it's so transformational in my thinking, especially about energy use and fossil fuels. And it was at a Liberty Summer seminar put on by Pierre Desrochers at his family property. I think the year was 1997. And you showed
probably 2007, if I'm not mistaken.
No. You just don't want to date us.
That's okay, fair enough.
It was back when I was doing property rights advocacy. That's why I know it was in the 90s. Okay. But it was so interesting to look at the transformation from old fuels to new fuels and some of the reason for that, but also how when we began that transformation to fossil fuels, how our companies just kept getting better and better and better at finding useful purposes for the waste products. And I think it's going to frame a lot of our talk today. So I wanted to just revisit some of that early thinking that you had, and then we'll move on to some of the other things that you've written about more recently. But tell us how you came to the issue of looking at this kind of energy transformation in the way that I've described it.
Well, the main reason why I ended up being a geographer is that no other department would take it. My ideas were too weird. And what I wanted to do at the time was to bring ideas from cognitive psychology and human creativity and apply that to how people come up with new ideas to help improve the environment. And so I ended up writing a dissertation looking at how people will use knowledge developed in one field and apply it to something completely different. So one case I documented ended up talking to 50 inventors. So I had people who worked in asphalt making, and at one point they end up working for a newsprint newspaper. So for young people, yes, news were once printed on paper. And these were technicians who were in charge of cleaning big tanks. And anyway, they had ideas which they brought, even though that wasn't planned, from asphalt making to cleaning up big tanks in the newspaper industry. And so I talked to a lot of people, and one thing that struck me quickly with studying inventors is that one characteristic that they all share is that they're allergic to waste. There's nothing that will trigger the brain, if you will, of inventors more than a waste product. They need to find something useful to do with it. And so that was not my original goal, but I started taking notes. And because my thesis topic was a bit weird, I began reading a lot on the history of technology. And I kept running across this pattern of people having found ways to turn industrial waste into lucrative byproducts. And I was collecting anecdote, but I was like, okay, what can I do with that? I would need something more systematic. And so this was in the mid-90s when the internet was not what it is today. So I ended up spending a summer in Washington, D.C. And one day I'm at the Smithsonian Institute where I was researching the same topic. They have this sort of creativity innovation center. I wanted to talk to some people there, but I had 50 minutes to kill at one point. So I said, well, could I just sit at one of your laptop and look at your private collection? And so I just entered this notion waste product before 1900. And then I found a treasure trove of stuff at the Smithsonian, which today is completely available online through archive.org or other things. So I remember the hours I spent copying books that were long out of print, whereas today you just download the PDF. But it turns out that a number of people in the 19th century had actually documented this process of turning industrial waste into something valuable. And the main industry in which this occurred was something that was called coal gas manufacturing. So today we don't remember that, but before electricity came along, the way a lot of things were lit in cities, from street lights to lamp into houses, was essentially to bring coal in city by trains and essentially heat it with steam. And you would get a gas out of that would then be piped to street lights and houses. But the process created a lot of very nasty byproduct. The worst of which was something called coal tar. So at first people don't know what to do with it, so they bury it, but it kills all the vegetation. You throw it in the river, then fishermen would launch lawsuits against you. You try to burn it, and the whole neighborhood would be covered in dark smoke. You would get other lawsuits that way. But after about 20 years, after a generation, after hundreds of chemists waste work on these issues, this waste product essentially became the foundation of our modern synthetic world. And so a problem was then turned into all sorts of things, from things to wash cattle, to insecticides, to dyes, to all sorts of other things. And eventually all this sort of chemical knowledge was eventually applied to the petroleum refining industry. Because at first in petroleum refining, the only thing that people were interested in was the fraction, which most people will know as kerosene, which was a substitute for whale oil. But gasoline at first was a waste product. People didn't know what to do with it. The heavier fractions were also waste products. But eventually, everything ended up being used in the petroleum industry. And so, but every other industry, meat packing, whatever, you can see that there were serious pollution problems in the 19th century. But all of these problems were looked at by creative people as opportunities. And so instead of having the kind of mindset that environmental activists have today, which is, oh my God, there's a source of pollution, there's a problem, let's destroy it. The dominant mindset at the time was to say, okay, now it's a problem, but a problem is by definition an opportunity. So let's see what we can do with that.
It's such a remarkable story, because I think that thinking is, I don't know if it's been overtaken by the green movement, or if somehow viscerally we don't believe it. But so much of your writing centers around that I want to just see if you've gone back and pieced together what it is about humanity, or the way we've organized our society, or the way markets work, that lend itself to taking a waste product and turning it into something useful. So I don't know how far back you go in prehistory, but is there something visceral with humanity that we just don't want to waste anything that we take from nature? Is that where it comes from?
That's how creative people react. But what I also found, and I've gone back to Thomas Malthus. I mean, to be honest, I go back to cave people, where you can see, well, somebody one day had the idea of, well, we can actually burn fat to create light, or we can use bones to do, turn them into musical instruments, of all sorts of things. So creative people have always had this sort of inclination. But what you see also historically is that a lot of people always believe, they sort of anticipate Malthus, if only in a sort of primitive way. You can go back to antiquity, where you have that mindset thinking that, well, the more of us there are, the more wealth, the more of an impact we must have on the environment. Because how can you have, let's say, 1 billion poor people, as was the case around 1800, and not imagine that these people had less of an impact on the environment than 8 billion much wealthier people today? And that's because people don't understand the sort of qualitative changes that occur in an economy over time. It's not just that, the waste of one industry becomes a valuable input of another, and so you stop releasing pollution in the environment. You sort of close the loop on industrial activities, but it's that new things are added continually to what we have. And so one thing that a lot of people not understand these days, and why I think a lot of the hatred towards fossil fuels is misplaced, is that up until the 1800s, by and large, everybody on the planet was only using things that grew on the surface of the planet, so biomass. So whale oil, cotton, fuel wood, timber. People used to grow all sorts of plants to produce dyes, for example. But over time, one product after another was replaced by things that came from below the surface. So not just, minerals that we can use as fertilizers, but also obviously coal, petroleum, and what have you. And so what humanity has done over time is substitute things that used to grow on the surface of the planet by things that we extracted from below. And simultaneously, we've been able to close the loop on a lot of what were once polluting emissions and turn them into something that we use. And so paradoxically, there's more of us, we have more stuff, we're wealthier, but the planet is greener than it's been in a long time, because in poor societies, well, people cut down trees or collect fuel wood to heat their places because their agriculture is very unproductive. They practice slash and burn, they move around, and so there are actually a lot less trees in poorer economy with fewer people than richer economy with a lot more people but better technologies. And so ultimately, I think the debate boils down to the issue of have humans evolved beyond other animal species? And what critiques of Malthus and others have understood for over 200 years is that, like it or not, humans are different. We're the only species that trade. We exchange physical good among ourselves. No other animal species does that. I mean, the only kind of trade you see among other species is services, let's say grooming for protection type of thing. But humans also are the only species that is creative the way we are. So yes, the essence of creativity is combining existing things in new ways. So the more we invent, the more we can invent. A beaver, for example, will combine mud logs and rock to create a dam, but that's all that they do. Whereas human beings, the way creative, the technically creative among us are wired anyway, is that they're quintessential problem solvers. They see problems where most of us would be happy with the status quo. And the way you come up with new solutions is that you combine existing things in new ways. So the more you invent, the more you can invent. And in that way, you could argue that human beings have evolved beyond other animal species. But the problem with environmental scientists, with environmental activists, is that they don't want to admit that. Humans are just one species among another, and the more of us there are, the more resources we must use.
I think you've hit on something important there, and you've put so much on the table. I don't want to lose the thread in talking about Thomas Malthus, because as I read your piece, well, you give a critique of Václav Smil, and I know you're a little reluctant to do that. We'll talk about that one too. But my sense of Thomas Malthus is that he has really been, I don't know, call him the patron saint of the environmental movement, and this notion that humanity population was going to grow so fast we'd outpace our food supply. That seems to be embedded in so much of the environmental movement, their policy recommendations, their prescriptions for the future, that I think it's important for us to understand what Thomas Malthus said. And you even said, maybe we look back on him a little bit unfairly because he modified his views somewhat over time. So tell us a little bit about this theory and where it first came from, because I think, again, viscerally, I think we do believe that there has to be a point at which we have too many people populating the planet, consuming too much, and there's got to be a limit, some limit to growth. So tell us a little bit more about where this came from with Malthus.
Okay. Well, the thing people should first understand about Malthus is that he was reacting to an ongoing debate. And the full title of his essay essay on population, which is first published in 1798, is something along the lines of a critique of William Godwin and the Marquis de Condorcet. So William Godwin was a prominent anarchist philosopher. He was English, and the Marquis de Condorcet was a Frenchman, more of a classical liberal free market type. But both Godwin and Condorcet conveyed an idea which is fairly common in the Enlightenment, is that while we're beginning to understand nature, we can use resources more efficiently, we understand how things are done, and we can improve on nature. And so Godwin and Condorcet in the 1790s are among the two most prominent people who say, well, the more of us there is, the better off we will be, because more people not only means more mouths to feed, but also more hands to work and more things, more brains to think of new solutions. So both Condorcet from a more free market perspective and Godwin from a more anarchist, which in those days was kind of communist socialist perspective, argue that, well, isn't it great? We understand our environment better. And so the more of us there are, the more we keep creating knowledge, the better off humanity will be. Now, Malthus' essays first comes out in 1798, which is the height of the Napoleonic Wars in Britain. Europe is not doing well. There's a blockade against Great Britain. The mood is really not good in the UK. And he says, no, Godwin is wrong. Condorcet are wrong. The more of us there is, the more we're likely to run into into all kinds of problems. The short version of the story is that Malthus essentially reacts against his father because his father was a fan of the people like Godwin, Rousseau, Condorcet, who made the opposite case. And he comes up with this little essay, which he first publishes anonymously. And to his surprise, it becomes a bestseller. And so what he does then later on, and the second edition, I believe, comes out in 1803, is that he goes back to the problem because a lot of critics hammer him right away, say, no, you don't understand. Humans are not like other animals. We will come up with other things, with other ways. And from 1803 until the last edition of his essay, which is either in the late 1820s or early 1830s, he keeps backtracking. And in the end, if you read the last edition of his book, he's like, well, yeah, there might be a problem, but perhaps we can sort of solve things if we're careful. So he remains a Malthusian, but he's nowhere as radical as the first edition of his essay. Now, unfortunately, his first essay is too well written. He has this sort of formula that comes out of nowhere, really, that says, well, the problem is that the population increases geometrically, whereas the food can only increase arithmetically. And it really comes out of nowhere. He has no basis to argue that. And then throughout the 19th century, you've got this debate going back and forth. People who will follow Malthus will say, well, obviously, we cannot keep increasing our numbers. But he has a number of opponents who are both communists. I mean, Marx and Engels really hated Malthus, but also a number of free market types at the time. Jean-Baptiste Say was probably the foremost French free market economist in the early 19th century, wrote directly to Malthus. They had letters with each other, and Say's like, no, you're wrong. I mean, what matters is production. It's not how many of us there are. And the more of us, again, this basic arguments, the more we'll be able to create. And so all the way up essentially to the 1960s and 1970s, hardcore Marxists are profoundly anti-Malthusian. They say, well, no, the solution is production. Mao, for example, in China says China's greatest resources is its people, as long as they're led by the Communist Party, which will, deliver all these things. But eventually, of course, the communists are never able to deliver on what they promise. And in advanced economies, well, you always had a few free market types who will make the same argument, but instead of saying that the Communist Party should lead, they will say, well, the price system will do the trick because, if a resource becomes scarce, its price goes up, so people have an incentive to look for substitute, use it more efficiently, and look for more deposit of whatever we're looking at. But one problem in advanced economies, I would argue, and maybe my fellow economists won't like me when I say that, is that as economics becomes more mathematized, this whole notion of creativity is sort of lost in the equation. Economists are not really able to model it, and so they end up focusing on the effect of the price system, which is great, but they say technological change, we don't know where it comes from, it's an endogenous factor, it's mystery out there. Whereas previous, less mathematically inclined generations of economists better understood that. But for reasons that are beyond me, every generation Malthusians are reborn, and every generation they're proven wrong. So usually when you read the story today, well, there was Malthus in 1798, then you jump to Paul Ehrlich in 1968, and there was nothing in between. Well, no, every generation you have the same arguments over and over again. Malthusians are defeated every time. And I think the problem, as I was mentioning before, is that ultimately you've got to take side. Have humans evolved beyond other animal species? Are we able to do things and to keep expanding on our knowledge base in a way that other species don't? Or are we just one species that other species don't? Which means that we're limited by the carrying capacity of our environments. There can only be so much of us. And I think ultimately what determines where you fall on in this debate over the last 2 centuries is your view of human natures. Are we different, or are we just one species among many others?
Let's talk a little bit about that, because I think intellectually, the Earth is finite, therefore it must have a finite amount of life it can support, and there must be a finite amount of resources we can extract from it. And I don't know if anyone has ever modeled it out the other way. If we were to get to the limit of the Earth's capacity to support us, how many people would we be able to have on planet Earth? I don't know what that number is. And maybe that's what's missing, is if you could say, oh yeah, we could easily grow to 100 billion people on the planet, then maybe we wouldn't be all that concerned that we're only at 8 billion. But I think when we're looking at historically, and when we first began only having tens of thousands of people and then just millions, and then the massive growth that we've seen in the last 200 years, people are uneasy about it. But do you have any way of us thinking about what the true carrying capacity of the Earth might be? How many people the Earth truly may be able to support?
Well, I'm more of a historian than a modeler, but what I can tell you is that I've gone back in history, and every time we hit a new billion, or we're about to add a new billion to human population, a number of highly credentialed people do freak out. So a lot of the literature in the post-World War II era, you've got Malthusianism is essentially reborn in the post-World War II era. My take on this is that you had a bunch of eugenicists who suddenly kind of look bad after what the Nazis did in Europe, but they still have funding, they have positions. So what do? Well, they reinvent themselves as neo-Malthusian. And you can see the big freak out in 1947, 1948 is to say, well, there were 2 billion of us, but now with those new medicines that we've developed, people don't die as much as they did before, and we're going to be 3 billion, perhaps even 4 billion. How will we survive that? There's no way the Earth can support 4 billion people, especially if they begin to have North American standards of living. And then in the 1960s, well, the world population is at still, 3.5, getting close to 4 billion people. Then some people are like, my God, we'll be 5 billion soon, 6 billion. How can we survive? And so there is no such thing as an inherent carrying capacity to human beings. So yes, I'm with you. On the one hand, the Earth is finite. Different kinds of stuff on it. But then the other part of the equation is the amount of technical knowledge that people have, and whether or not you're in a market economy, and if you can trade and specialize and do all these things. And so, there was more of an optimistic spirit at one point, perhaps best conveyed by, okay, it's been decades since I've seen that, but let's say Star Trek. How many people live on the Earth in Star Trek? Like,
well, I guess I'm thinking of the Isaac Asimov series. Yes, and people are living in layers going down into the center of the Earth. And so somebody did forecast that we would have quite different circumstances if the population kept growing well into the future. But maybe the other part of it is that we always have these instances around the world of extreme famine. And yes. So I think that lends itself to saying, oh my goodness, something collapsed in the food supply there, in the support of the people. And I think it's because Malthus has just been embedded in so many different iterations of academia that we connect that kind of trauma and that kind of devastation with the inability to have the food supply growing.
That is true, but at the same time, I was mentioning the exchange of letter between in the early 1800s. And in one of those letters, Say says to Malthus, you're completely wrong. We're much less likely to have famine today than was the case in the Middle Ages. And one reason why Say is a bit more optimistic, even though people in the 1800s were incredibly poor by today's standards, was that, the Americas were discovered, the potato came over to Europe, suddenly the food supply goes up a lot, corn became important in various parts of Southern Europe. People developed better agricultural techniques, better rotations. The land was left in fallow a lot less than was the case before. And so already Say says to Malthus, I don't know if they ever met in person, but at least in letters, look, there's more of us, but we're less likely to have famine than was the case in the Middle Ages. And what people also understand in the 19th century is that the one thing that put an end to famine was long-distance trade. You see, one problem with environmentalists is some of them anyway want us to revert back to bioregions or local food, and they say, well, we should live in harmony with our local environment, and we should not capture resources from the whole planet. But the only thing that put an end to famine historically was long-distance trade, because try as you might, farmers, in a tropical system, in a temperate system, whatever, will have bad years. And historically, 2 bad years in a row and you would have a famine. Doesn't matter how few people are in your local regions. I mean, if you've got frost, if you've got a fungus infestation, if your livestock gets sick and die, bad things will happen. And so historically, the only thing that really put an end to famine was the ability to move large quantities of food cheaply over long distances. And so the first two economies that see famine disappear are the Netherlands and England in the 17th century, because they've got the best sailing ships in the world at the time. And if something goes wrong, they can always send their ships anywhere to find food. But really what makes a difference is the advent of the railroad and the steamship in the 19th century. So steamships are a lot big. A steel ship can be way, way bigger than a wooden sailboat. It can go against ocean currents. It can go against. And so suddenly, places like Canada, Australia, Argentina open up. You've got a lot more grain that is available. The potato famine was. Don't forget that. Yeah, at the same time, you had the potato disease, not just in Ireland, but also in North America and in Western Europe. The reason why things were so bad in Ireland is because it was much less open to trade than other parts of the world. And I'm 1/8 Irish, so maybe I'm allowed to say bad things about the English, but it's the way the English had run Ireland for a long time. So I think the causes were much more political. So yes, a lot of people suffered in the 1840s in Europe with the potato disease, but the situation was especially worse in Ireland because a lot of people had reverted back to a form of subsistence farming based on potatoes. But after that, basically, you have other potato epidemics in the 19th century. We don't hear about them because, people were able to bring food from other places. The problem you have in the 19th century, and stop me if this is too much, but with the railroad, you've got different populations of livestock that come in contact with each other, and you've got big livestock epidemics in the 1860s in Europe. Rinderpest, among other things. And so at one point, most of the livestock, at least the cattle, most of the cattle in England dies in the 1860s. But we don't hear about it because then you can bring in meat at that point from Argentina, from New Zealand, from other places. And so it's not the number of people, it's not their level of wealth, it's not how well in harmony they live with their local environment, but long distance trade that among other, and agricultural advances and all that comes with human creativity that put an end to famine. But again, for most people, admitting that humans are different and that what makes us unique ultimately is our ability to trade and to create new things is just something they're not really willing to consider.
Let's talk a bit about that, because I think that you've talked about subsistence farming, and it's funny, you're a geographer, we're talking about economic issues, but I'm going to turn it again to human psychology, because there is something that is so attractive about the idea that we would buy local and we would grow our own food and we'd be in touch with the land and we wouldn't have to bring in spinach and strawberries from Mexico. There's just something visceral, I think, about wanting to provide locally. And I don't know where that comes from. Maybe I need to talk to an evolutionary biologist on it, but you've looked at this a lot.
And I would say ultimately it's because we're tribal creatures. Long distance trade has only really existence for, you had it in the past for things like grain, dry cod, what have you, but really the kind of globalization that we experience today has only been around since the advent of the steam engine and fossil fuels. For most of human history, and if you go back even before the advent of agriculture, most people lived in small tribes and we don't like the neighbors. I live in Toronto. How else can you explain why people root for the Maple Leafs? That's beyond me. I'm from Montreal. So, it's the tribal mindset really is something that is deeply ingrained in people, even though it shouldn't be. But I think ultimately that's what it is. And you've had a pushback against long distance trade ever since these things have been around. Ever since long distance trade has been around. Typically, it's pushed by local farmers who don't like the competition, obviously. But beyond traditional, let's say, interest group or protectionist, or traditional protectionist instincts of local producer, a lot of people feel a visceral connection to their environment. They want to belong to a tribe. It's us against them. And I think ultimately the real roots of the environmental movement can be traced back to the Romantic movement. A lot of people don't like the steam engine. It seems unnatural. In the 19th century, a lot of environmentalists are actually very conservative because they don't like urbanization, the dislocation of the countryside. A lot of people back then are subsistence farmer. They're like, it's not really a life. It's not a lifestyle I like. In cities, you've got excitement. I've got a regular paycheck. My crop is not going to fail. At least my paycheck is likely to be more regular. And so there's a lot of transformation going on in the 19th century. But you always have agrarian movements, agrarian intellectuals, aristocrats who don't like to see the peasants leaving the farm and, jacking up the price of labor, places like Western and Eastern Europe. And so, yeah, there's a lot of that. And unfortunately, there's this sort of anti-technology, anti-change, anti-trade, anti-globalization mindset that, among other things, expresses itself in large part, I think, through the modern environmental movement.
Well, let's talk a bit about this term that you have called Locavoreism, Locavore, because I think you get into this a bit. Now, look, I have attempted to become a green thumb, and I've attempted to grow my own vegetables and produce, and I fully understand that I would starve to death if I had to be self-reliant. But there is still this idea, well, if I can't provide it myself, then I should at least buy from the local greenhouse and use the local livestock producer and butcher, that I should still be aiming to support those in my local community. So that locavorism, I maybe have a default to that, but you're going to disabuse me of all of this because you've got 5 myths about locavorism that I want to go through with you.
Okay, let me put it this way. So let me first point the obvious. So as long as we don't import food from outer space, good quality food, the best food at any given point in time, will have to be grown somewhere on Earth. And perhaps at certain times of the year, it will be in your neighbor's backyard, or it will be, the pastures of Alberta or what have you. So I'm not against local food when people would buy it for reasons other than being local. Meaning that local food at certain times of the year gives you the best quality price ratio. Then, well, of course, I'm not against that. What I'm against is guilting people into buying local food when you pay more for lesser quality. So while I live in southern Ontario, yeah, in season I'll buy peaches from Niagara. Ontarians are finally learning to make cider, decent cider. I'm from Quebec, so that's a long story. I mean, I could say bad things there, but I found a decent cider producer 40 minutes north of my house. So of course I support a local thing. They're pretty good. They don't produce their own apples, though. I mean, they tell me that they're from somewhere in southern Ontario, that they're kind of some older varieties. I don't know where their apples come from, but I buy it because I don't want to shop at the LCBO. It's a personal stance, and their cider is pretty good. So I have no problem against that. So as long as the best quality price ratio is available in your backyard or in your part of the world, then I have no problem with that. But there are a number of problems, and there are a number of reasons why historically a lot of people work very hard and very long to create our globalized food supply chain. So one argument that is used by local food activists is that, well, I don't know who produces my food anymore. And if I got to know my local farmer, well, perhaps we would become friends and my local community would be better. Okay. Again,
is that what is? I have the list of 5 in front, so I want to make sure that I don't miss out on anyone.
That's the number 1, if I remember correctly.
Nurture social capital.
Local social capital. So somehow you go to the farmer's market and you get to talk to people who produce your food, and your community benefits as a result. Okay, yeah, you will get to know people that way. If they sell you the best food at the best price, obviously I have no problem with that. But I don't know who made my shirt. I don't know who made my cell phone. There are many other ways to create social capital when the politicians don't keep us locked down. So, you can volunteer. If we ever get back to normal, you can volunteer to coach a little league soccer. You can get involved in your church, whatever. Why is food better than those other ways of creating social capital? Or why is this better than having your teenager work at your local supermarket and getting to know, how the food system works or what have you? But the problem with that is that you've got to understand, well, if buying directly from producers is so great, why do we have wholesalers? Why do we have retailers? Why do you have supermarkets? Well, it turns out you can go back to Plato. Plato isn't very good about economics, but he writes something about food, and he says, well, why do we have a market? Well, it often happens that when the farmer comes to the city, the consumers are not there. And so what the farmers do is that, well, they sell their stuff to people who are full-time merchants and who provide the service when the consumers will show up. And so what you see historically is that most farmers don't really like to talk to people anyway. They would rather produce food. So they're happy to let people who work full-time connecting producers and consumers. And that's why in any market economy, historically, you've had food retailers. And funnily enough, you also see that in Toronto. There's a local business here. Sometimes you see their truck. If you live in Toronto, it's called 100-kilometer food. And essentially what these people realized, they were two pharmaceutical representatives, at least the ones who started that, was that, well, you've got farmers who really like to grow food, not so much to sell them. And then you've got fancy restaurants, fancy little shops that would like to buy food, but calling 25 farmers is really a pain in the neck. So spontaneously, intermediaries emerge. And if you look at what's going on in Toronto, it's something that was completely predictable. The local farmers were able to make a living out of that, produce very fancy stuff, and the people who buy this food are very fancy people, overeducated academic types, fancy restaurants, what have you. And so, but the original promise of the local food activists was that, well, if we have more local food, we'll produce better quality food, more affordable, and we'll get rid of all those useless intermediaries between farmers and final consumers. But it turns out that, for a few thousand years, you've had retailers, and there's a reason why they're there. So that's the first myth that I sort of deal with. But it also turns out, if you go to a local farmer's market, the only thing that will be local about the apple that you buy there is that it was bought at the local Costco, So it's not because somebody tells you something in person that they won't pull your leg. So.
I like the history that you are charted out there, that the intermediaries are going to develop just out of necessity, because if you want to be a producer, you want to produce, and you need somebody else then to market your product for you. Let's go on to the next one, because then we talk about how buying local would promote economic development. I suppose this is something that can go across all sorts of different products. But you know what comes to mind is when there was a great outcry, again, maybe the Canadian tribal spirit kicked in, when French's ketchup was about to go under, and somebody took to Facebook and said, no, we must buy local, we must support this. So everybody stopped buying Heinz ketchup, which was also produced in Canada.
Exactly. All the tomatoes are produced in Southern Ontario anyway, so yes.
But is there something to that, though? You want to make sure that you have your neighbors employed in these kinds of professions, whether they're direct producers or whether they're the intermediaries. So why not support more local produce and more local food
because
production?
Again, if you spend more for a lesser quality product, you have less money to buy other things that are produced locally or elsewhere, but might be sold by local people. So if I spend more money on food, I've got less money to get a haircut. I've got less money to spend on other products that are available around. And you don't develop an economy by paying more for lesser quality products. You develop an economy by paying less for better quality product, which allows you then to spend your money on other things and create other kinds of work. And so productivity gains, if I may speak like an economist, even though I'm a geographer, are what really drives economy. You need to do more with less to create more jobs, to make sure that, the less you spend on food, the more you can spend on other things. And that's how ultimately you develop your local economy. And if you stop buying from other people, well, why do you expect them to buy from you? So it's just a matter, you specialize in what you do best, you produce the best quality product at the lowest price, you trade with each other, and that's how you end up creating more jobs overall. A lot of jobs existed in my local community that didn't exist 50, 100, 150 years ago. And if people, I said instead, well, no, let's keep buying local food that is not competitive, well, we wouldn't have the kind of development and other career opportunities that are now available. So again, I'm not against local food when it's something that you would buy because it's the best thing available, not because it's local. But if you pay more for lesser quality product, no, you don't create jobs, you destroy jobs. But you need to look beyond what's immediately obvious.
Truly, and it makes sense in Canada for us to have this conversation because we are a food producer that exports a great amount of food to the rest of the world. So we do have a comparative advantage in it in the first place. But I understand sort of the theoretical argument you're making. Go on to this next one because it's a little more difficult for me. The notion of buying local is it's because it's tastier, it's more nutritious, it's safer. I think everybody will have that experience of getting garden carrots from their grandma's garden or plucking off a nice plump raspberry or cherry tomato. And we just have the experience of it being so delicious that you think, well, of course, if there was less transportation cost, less time between it getting from the garden to my plate, of course, it's going to be more tasty and more nutritious. But you dispute that one too.
Well, again, you might get carrots out of your grandmother's garden for what, 3 weeks maybe? I don't know what kind of variety they grow. I don't know what kind of things they grow. So for 3 weeks a year, if your grandmother is willing to grow the carrots and give them to you, yeah, of course you'll get them because they're the best alternative available. The problem with local food activists is that they equate freshness with better taste and better nutrition. The reality is a bit more complex because cooked tomatoes are actually more nutritious. Canned tomatoes are actually more nutritious than raw tomatoes. But if you forget that, if you just take the local food activist at their word, if freshness is the key, then you can't have that in Canada. I mean, yeah, things will be available for a few weeks, but for the rest of the year, if you want to consume local food, well, you've got to freeze it, you've got to can it, you've got to dry it. So if your key is freshness, then you can't win, because what happens is that one of the things I teach in my introductory geography course is that there are different seasons in different hemispheres. So, when it is the summer in the northern hemisphere, it's the winter in the southern hemisphere. So if you go to Australia, they celebrate Christmas in the middle of their summer. And if you look at the way things ripen up in North America, well, latitude does matter. So a century ago, for example, if you looked at the potato supply of large cities like New York and Boston, well, the first tomatoes that would show up would first come from Bermuda, because Bermuda is in the Gulf Stream, and they would get the first harvest of potatoes. And then the Florida potatoes would come along, and then northern Florida, and then Georgia, and then the middle states, all the way up to the St. John River in New Brunswick. And so what long distance trade allowed you to do was, instead of harvesting local food and trying to store it in a root cellar or a primitive warehouse back in those days, people would consume food for wherever it was from when it was fresh, and then they would switch to other producers. And that way the food was better, you had a lot less waste in storage. Apples, if you leave them for 5 months in a root cellar, well, you lose a number of them. The taste won't be as good. And so what the railroad especially does is that it sort of kills this habit that people have developed historically to store their local food for several months through the year. And instead, they increasingly rely on fresh food that comes from ever further away. And if you look, for example, at kiwi productions, well, New Zealand for a long time was the main kiwi producers, but then people in other parts of the main kiwi producer that producing kiwi. And in Europe, the Italians are especially good at that. So I'm told that at certain times of the years when you go to New Zealand, well, you will find Italian kiwis. Why is that? Well, because instead of letting them sit in storage, gobbling up energy to maintain constant temperatures, CO2 content, what have you, you ship them to be eaten fresh, put them on a container ship. A couple of weeks later, they're on supermarket shelves in North America. The food is cheaper, it is fresher, you have less waste. And at other times of the year, even if you're a big kiwi producer from New Zealand, it just makes sense to import kiwis that were just picked off the tree a few weeks before in Italy. And that way you have fresher food, less waste, better taste. And so when local food producers tell you, or local food advocates tell you, well, freshness is the key. Well, yeah, okay. So local will lose, because at best in a temperate climate like ours, you can get fresh food a few weeks each year for whatever it is that you're consuming.
The way you answered that last question makes this next one seem like you've already answered it too, because the issue of food security. Part of what I'm seeing is that we're getting better at greenhouse technology. We're getting better at vertical farming, where you can have 16-story buildings and build and create all your fresh greens locally. I don't know that they've mastered it for some of the root vegetables, but for some, it seems to be working quite well. So I think we have this notion that, with the world being what it is, geopolitical issues, oftentimes we have food recalls that take place. And so you have massive food recalls of all types of product. I think there's this sense that, well, once we develop a technological solution for us to be able to grow food year round, that should still be the default for the purpose of food security. But you wouldn't think so either. And tell me why not.
No, and that's because historically you had very sophisticated local food systems. So the one that is best documented and was probably the most sophisticated historically developed around Paris in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. So what people did in Paris is that they built a lot of walls, because if you've ever lived in an old urban neighborhood, surrounded by brick houses, you'll understand that bricks in the summer will capture a lot of heat, which they release in the middle of the night. And so my father, who grew up in a working class neighborhood in Montreal, would tell me, how bad things were at night because the buildings were releasing all that heat. And so you have a lot of these walls around Paris where they grew fruit trees, but also a number of producers who use essentially glass jars. I mean, they're designed for that, in which they grow vegetables. So they build walls around their gardens to cut the wind, create a liquid microclimate. You have a lot of horse manure available because this is before the cars came along. They make those big straw mats, which they paint black, which, so you have your horse manure, you plant something, you have your cloche, you have your straw mat, you have your wall around that. And you have very sophisticated greenhouse systems built around cities like Paris. And again, Paris, it's the one time in my life as a researcher that speaking French was actually useful because I could go back to the original sources that were not translated. And what's interesting is that there's a book written in 1840 by two producers around Paris. I'm sure they got help at the time, but they describe the kind of life that they lead. And they say, well, people have been producing food in cities forever, but our parents only became respected when they were able to grow green asparagus year round. Because then suddenly there were some skills involved and people began to respect them. And then they describe how fancy people in restaurants or people who cook for rich people will establish a special connection with them to make sure they always have their fresher produce. But what you realize is that these people, they work in season like 18 hours a day. They go in the market, they live in basically horse manure all the time. It's not like you can pull on or off a switch, so they've got to bring their water. And it's really a lot of work. So what they do is that if people come in from London and offer more money, you can bet that they will sell their food and some of it will find its way to London. So the system is so sophisticated that by the late 19th century, they even produce pineapples around Paris, pineapples. But then what happens? Well, the railroad comes along and suddenly people realize, oh, well, we can grow all that stuff along the Mediterranean coast for a lot less trouble. I don't have to spend my day, turning up those cloches and what have you. So within a matter of years, all this sophisticated greenhouse and other systems that existed at the time around Paris will disappear. On the one hand, the land around Paris becomes too valuable. People want to build manufacturers. A lot of people are moving in. And there's just not enough money in producing vegetables and fruits around Paris to keep that going. And then, well, around the Mediterranean, in Italy, southern France, Spain, nature gives you the heat free of charge. And then at the same time, synthetic fertilizers come along. So the story is a bit more complex, but long story short, we had very sophisticated local food systems in cities in the past. And they disappeared because it just makes more sense to grow certain types of food in certain regions. Now, what you see happening in a country like Canada, yes, we do produce tomatoes in greenhouses or other things, but they're typically high-end market products. The ketchup tomatoes, the tomatoes that are grown for low-end uses like ketchup, they're not produced in greenhouses. Doesn't make sense. Just you grow them in Florida, grow them in Mexico. For ketchup, they're good enough. The one company in Quebec with which I was more familiar, the one we have near Windsor here in southern Ontario, they tend to produce the kind of tomatoes that are kind of fancier and will end up, it will be the more expensive one in your supermarket. And so, yes, the technology will be developed, but typically you can have greenhouses in the countryside and there's really nothing that you can produce in the city that you cannot produce more cheaply in the countryside with greenhouses.
I do have to get you to give a plug for Quebec maple syrup, though, because that does seem to be something that is very geographically located, very regional, and very hard to replicate.
It is, although unfortunately the industry is so regulated in Quebec that they've been shooting themselves in the foot. The government has tried to restrain the amount of maple syrup that can be produced, and as a result, people in Vermont and New Brunswick have been stealing market share. That's another debate. But yeah, that's one thing. Another thing that people don't realize, let's say if you look at oranges, you might think, well, oranges, you can grow them anywhere in the tropics. No. You see, there are two places where you grow citrus fruits in North America. You've got Florida and you've got California. But in Florida, they specialize in oranges that will end up in juice. And in California, they end up producing oranges that will end up in supermarket shelves. What's the big difference? Well, the moisture content of the atmosphere. The climate is a lot drier in California. You've got much less of a pest problem. And so they can produce better quality products. They will grow the varieties that will end up in, like I said, being bought by consumers. Whereas in Florida, well, it's a bit more of a challenge. Yeah, the conditions are very good in other respects, but they've specialized in the type of oranges that are grown for juice and other secondary uses. So even in that respect, things are different. If I look out west, for example, as you know, in the Okanagan, well, you know this more than I do, but
they've got
they're
much
still
better
producing
peach
apple.
cider apparently in the Okanagan than they do in the East, because I've been drinking peach cider for over 20 years. So
well, maybe it's the variety, but why are people in the Okanagan successful? Well, because it's a drier climate. It's like Eastern Washington state. So it's easier to grow fancier apple in those kinds of environments because, again, it's drier, and a drier climate means you have less of other kinds of problems that you might have in other locations.
Well, this lends itself then to a good conversation and transition to our next topic, because the last reason why you'd want to buy local is, I think you described it as the locavorisms, or locavorists would say it heals the earth from a greenhouse gas perspective. And let me just connect what you've said, because you've talked about how vitally important local climatic conditions and geographic conditions are to producing particular types of food, which give that comparative advantage. But if you begin to start seeing climate change, then it can disrupt those food systems. Therefore, the argument is you've got to buy local, so you've got less transportation costs, you're producing fewer emissions, so that you can maintain that stability in the environment for all the reasons of food security and others that we've talked about before. But you don't think that that's a good argument either. So tell us why not.
Okay. First of all, for the previous one, the safety, I forgot to say, you buy food from supermarkets, not from people that you don't know in other countries. And no supermarket has any interest in poisoning their customers. So food safety, that matters too. Okay. As far as climate change, well, people tend to forget that farmers have had to adapt in the past, forget climate, just for market conditions. So at one point, some wine was produced in the Los Angeles region 100, 150 years ago, but the quality was terrible. It never really took off. And at one point, they realized, well, now forget that. We can actually grow citrus fruit competitively. And so people farmers there switch from growing grapes to growing citrus. The part of Quebec that I grew up in would have, when I was a kid, a lot of corn and potato producers. But these days, they found a niche in cruciferous, so cabbage, cauliflowers, and stuff. And you go there today, and farmers have just realized, well, it's easier to make a living growing different things than they were growing up, than they were growing when I was a kid. You see these days in Quebec and further up in Ontario, soybeans. Again, I grew up in a part of Quebec which has a lot of dairy cows, but you didn't have soybean varieties in the 1970s that could tolerate the local climate. These days, a lot more soybeans are grown in southern Quebec than was the case then. And farmers have switched to growing soybeans instead of corn, or at least rotating them in a way that didn't exist decades ago because it made sense economically. And so forget climate change. Farmers the world over have had to adapt and change production as new parts of the world were developed. So if I look at your part of the world, for example, Alberta, or perhaps more Saskatchewan or Manitoba, but let's say wheat production. Well, historically in Europe, cereal grains would keep for months. This is what most people were eating. And so they would grow cereal grains in really bad condition, slopes or mountains environment. And then suddenly with the steamship and the railroad, flat, fertile terrain opens up in Western Canada, the Northern Plains in the US, Argentina, Australia. So what do they do in Europe? Well, they can no longer compete. So they convert the land that they used to grow grain into orchards or to pasture land for dairy cows, again, just for economic reasons. So when I hear all this talk about climate change, oh, poor farmers, they won't be able to adapt. They only know how to do one thing. No, the people who have stuck to farming, less than about 1% of the population is still farming in advanced economies. The one that stayed are the smart ones, the good ones, the one with the green thumbs who can actually make a go at this. And if better opportunities come along, well, they will learn, they will adapt, and they will switch. They will switch crops just like their ancestors did, their parents did, their grandparents, their great grandparents did. For economic reasons. So even assuming the worst case scenario, let's say, oh my God, the temperature will go up on average 2.5 degrees. Well, if suddenly Montreal has the climate of New York City, well, perhaps they'll start growing more grapes around Montreal, and less cabbage or something else. What do I know? I mean, farmers will adapt. If there's one thing that agricultural history teaches us in the last 200 years is that if only for market considerations, farmers have to switch between crops all the time. So even if there's climate change, well, they'll adapt, and perhaps, yeah, things will move up north a little bit, and perhaps Canada will even have more agricultural land than was the case before, and Canada might actually benefit for all I know. So
let's talk a bit more then about your views on how what we need to do to mitigate on greenhouse gases, because it's very clear from our conversation and your historical perspective and your understanding of geography and food and food production methods that you have an immense amount of confidence that humanity will be able to adapt. But I would say that the prevailing view that we hear in the mainstream media is the Extinction Rebellion view, or the Greta Thunberg view, that humanity faces an existential crisis unless we stop producing so much greenhouse gas emissions, unless, and I think some of the more extreme environmentalists would say, we have to convert everything to wind and solar to the exclusion of fossil fuels, electrify the grid to the point where it can manage electric cars as well as home heating, and then eliminate the use of fossil fuels altogether within pretty short order. Some want 2030, some are saying 2050. So you don't share that kind of cataclysmic, catastrophic view about greenhouse gases. And I wonder how you put, when you hear those arguments, and they're the ones being made more frequently, how do you put them into context?
Okay, the first thing I will say is that the environmentalists were right in one context: communist economies, centrally planned economies. So yeah, things got worse. The pollution was extremely bad, and but in market economies, we've seen the exact opposites for reasons that I've discussed before: innovation, replacing stuff that grows on the surface of the planet that comes from underneath. So the problem with the Extinction Rebellion type, the Greta Thunberg of this world, is that, again, they don't understand what makes us human. And I'm not talking about emotion. God knows nobody will ever call me a romantic guy or whatever. But again, trading and creativity are what makes us different. And if people are free to try new things, if people are free to trade, to move, to relocate, to exchange goods and products, the evidence is overwhelming that we will create a world where more of us can live ever more comfortably, while at the same time reducing most of our impact on the environment. So one way I try to convey those ideas to my students is to show them pictures of Toronto over the last century and a half. So you've got these sorts of grainy, very dark pictures of Toronto that were taken around 1900, and you're like, well, it must be because the photography technology back then was very primitive. No, it's because Toronto was covered in soot, because people were burning coal, and because you can see the sky is extremely dark, and that's because people were using coal at the time, which was still better than using wood, which is another thing. But you can see that over time, other things come along. So hydroelectricity. So people began damming the Niagara rivers. They're able to ship the electricity to Toronto, to Hamilton. Then heavy oil comes along, product of refining. So trucks deliver that in a big tank in your basement. I mean, New Brunswick and other parts of the country still mostly get their heat that way. Then natural gas eventually comes along. And so just because there were economic advantages to have those transitions, the governments never push for energy transitions. People just develop better ways of doing things. So for the kids out there, yes, there was once a world without cell phones. And, we used to have all this copper wiring that was connecting buildings, and that's how people used to transmit information. No government sponsored the emergence of a transition from copper wiring to cell phone. It happens because creative people were free to innovate. And as a result, a lot of copper was actually dug up from the ground and became available for other uses. And you had the same thing going on in the energy world. Now, what you need to understand is, why did these things happen? Yes, economically, they made more sense, but they also had a number of other advantages. So if you go back in time, 2-3 centuries, if there's one thing that Europe is not lacking of, it's windmills. You have windmills everywhere. You've got small dams on every little brooks and streams there, because there's no electricity. And people need torque, people need to create power, and there's only so much that human and animal muscle can do. But why do people give up on windmills and replace them with steam engine, with burning coal? Well, for the same reasons that renewable power doesn't work today. So the wind doesn't work most of the time. You can only have windmills in certain locations. They're completely unpredictable. So yes, you buy a steam engine, you need to get the coal delivered, but you know exactly how much power you will generate. You know that it will be reliable. You know that, so see, for at one point, why does steam engines, for example, replace windmill in pumping water out of mines, which is one of their first uses? Well, because most of the time the wind doesn't blow when you dug stuff out of the ground in England. Well, you've got water everywhere. Your mines tend to flood. But the steam engine comes along. It's completely reliable. It can operate 24/7. No wonder people just give up on windmills. And also, not only on windmills are unreliable, but they produce very little in terms of torque, in terms of power. And so there's a reason why, yes, you could say windmill didn't generate pollution, which is true, and steam engines did. But you had so many more benefits having a steam engine over a windmill. That's no reason, no wonder why windmill disappear. So anyway, fast forward to the world of today, and the same basic problems are there, except that today we have an electric grid, and there's no giant battery anywhere. And so when you turn on the switch, you send a signal to the grid operators telling him, hers, or whatever, send me electricity right now. And you cannot simply operate a modern economy with unreliable, variable, quote unquote, renewable power. Yes, it's renewable, but it has a number of other environmental problems, you know, bats, birds, people who live near them. And so as a result, you need to build back up. Well, I don't know much. Stop me if that's too much, because if I go with all the problems, well, let me just say, Greta and Extinction Rebellions are wrong because they don't know any history. Otherwise, they would see why our systems evolved the way they did. And what I would tell them is that, well, I understand that you want to change the world, but shouldn't you also understand why our energy system evolved the way it did? And perhaps our ancestors were not stupid, and they switched from one mode of energy production to another because it had because there were benefits. You would get more energy, more reliability for less money. What is happening today in every country that tries to promote wind and solar power? Well, electricity costs go up. I don't care if the price of producing electricity with a wind turbine goes down. You need to build more transmission lines. You need to build backup power with natural gas. You need to build other redundancy in the system, or else you become a cheapskate and you have the situation that you had in Texas a few months ago and your whole grid might collapse, but that's another debate. And there are simply no benefits. In the end, there's no serious analysis that will tell you that you actually really reduce your greenhouse gas emissions that way. And so one joke we have in Quebec, when I was growing up in the Quebec countryside, people were very Catholic, and they used to build those big wooden crosses to show, you know, how Catholic they were. Well, in a way, wind turbines are kind of the same for environmentalists. Look at how green we are, but do they really contribute more to social welfare than those big wooden crosses that we used to build?
Well, I like the argument because you've been making it for years as well, and I've been adopting this argument also, that you cannot get to the new phrase, of course, is net zero emissions, and you can't get to net zero emissions on wind power until you have net zero concrete and net zero steel and net zero fiberglass and net zero transportation methods and net zero battery power. And I think you can make a similar argument on solar. And you know what I find interesting is that others have now adopted this argument that, again, you were making years ago. Michael Schellenberger, for instance, Apocalypse Never, and Jeff Gibbs and Michael Moore, their book Planet of the Humans. But what I found interesting about some of those, not Michael Schellenberger, he's very practical in his approach as an environmentalist, but it seems like some of the others who come to the conclusion that solar and wind isn't really as green as they thought, isn't free of fossil fuels, needs natural gas as a backup, they come to the same Malthus conclusion. That the only solution is there's too many people on the planet, and the only way for us to stop using as much fossil fuels or using fossil fuels is to have a smaller population. So tell me why that's a false argument when we're talking about energy now, because you've dismantled the argument when it came to food, but why is it a false argument when it comes to energy?
Well, it depends if it's if you want to be logically consistent. If you want a net zero for humanity, that's easy. Get rid of humans, which, you know, is essentially what the Malthusians will do, but to a lesser scale. So you've got people. I mean, yeah, I'm culturally Catholic. I'm not practicing Catholic, but the current Pope is a disgrace. That we have a long tradition of Catholic thinkers who understood what was wrong with Malthus, but the current Pope will have thinkers around him, well, thinkers, Naomi Klein and other people who will tell him, well, the earth can only support 1 billion people, and this is what we need to have. And that's again because they don't understand technological change. They don't understand that human creates, and they don't understand that we can do more with less. And again, burning coal, burning natural gas allows you not to burn wood, and it burns more cleanly. You can convert the byproducts into other useful things. And what frustrates me the most with someone like Michael Moore is that he came of age, he says, if you listen to him in an interview in the late 60s, he read The Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich, and basically what he's arguing today is exactly what he was arguing in 1970 when he sort of came of age as a young environmentalist. And yet he's old enough to remember the 70s. I mean, in Montreal, you still had a bunch of oil refineries in the eastern end of the city. The city was a lot more polluted than it is today. You had less people. I remember the water quality around Montreal when I was a kid was not always that great. But, you know, people become wealthier. They can afford better sewage treatment plants. They can afford all sorts of other infrastructure. And the only reason why our environment has gotten better, the only reason why Toronto today is a lot cleaner than it was a century ago, even though we have a population that is 10 times greater, is because we have more wealth, we have better technology. And this would not have been achieved with a smaller population, less human brains, and less creation of new technologies that can be recombined in new ways in order to create more stuff. So Michael Moore, Greta Thunberg, well, Greta, I mean, I don't like going after her because, you know, she's only been presented one side of the arguments.
Well, then let's put Naomi Klein there, because Naomi Klein has been the one writing about disaster capitalism and no logo. And maybe you should explore that just a little bit, because you've asserted, and I tend to believe, and I think that the evidence side by side stacks up, but you've asserted that capitalism and free enterprise and innovation actually creates better environmental outcomes than the alternative. And we've seen communistic regimes. Why would that be? Because I think that's the other part. And maybe, again, it goes back to our alligator brains and evolutionary biology. But I think we believe that there is some central planner out there who can just put all the variables into supercomputers with an artificial intelligence and machine learning and just figure it out. And then we just need to plan our way out of this. Why doesn't the planning approach work? If you know what outcome you want to achieve, you would think that having smart planners and more control would be the way to get to that outcome. Why doesn't that work?
Okay, well, first of all, because there's no way a few central planners, even if you select the people with the IQ of 200 in your economy and you put them in charge, there's no way they will know everything that people on the ground who deal with actual problems know what's around them. There's this argument of, okay, well, there are basically three problems with central planning. The first one is incentives. So if you treat everybody the same, nobody wants to be a janitor or a garbage man or what have you. So everybody wants to be a poet or a journalist, no offense. But also the kind of incentive that you have in central economies that let's say I want to produce 20 tons of nails. Well, the easiest way to achieve that as a manager, and that was the standard joke, is that, well, produce a nail that is that weighs 1 ton. 20 nails, you've met your quotas and what have you. And so there was this sort of problem going on. But anyway, so there's the problem of incentive. Then there's no price system. There are always many ways to achieve anything. Let's say you want to allow people to move across a river. Well, okay. You can have a ferry, you can dig a tunnel, you can have a bridge, you can build a bridge out of concrete, you can build it out of steel, out of other. There are many ways to build a bridge. What kind of design should you have? In a market economy, prices guide you in terms of selecting the best alternative among a wide array of achieving something. You never have that in a centrally planned economy. I mean, one reason why the Soviet Union lasted that long is that they planned basically by, they used to take the Wall Street Journal, look at the price of stuff in the United States and applied that in their central planning system. That's why they lasted. But ultimately also what people like Friedrich Hayek and others have argued is that doesn't matter how smart you are, there's only so much you can know about your environment. And a lot of the stuff that we know is knowledge of people who can help you knowledge of your local environment. I mean, why do we still have real estate agents? Yeah, like everybody else, I sold my house in Toronto recently because prices have gone through the roof. My real estate agent knows a lot about neighborhoods, about people, about stuff that can never be put or can never be found on a computer or what have you. And another problem that you had in communist economy is that everything is political and is basically run by thugs. And in a market economy, if you dump garbage in your neighbor's backyard, in theory, they can take you to court or whatever you have. You can do something against the polluter. If you're in China and the polluting factory is called Red Star or whatever, yeah, good luck. You can't bring lawsuits against people who run the system. And so it was a lack of incentive, corruption, thuggery, what have you. The only obligation of producers in a communist economy was to meet their output in terms of quota. Whatever else was just like nobody cares. And people who suffered from pollution had no recourse against the factory. So anyway, yes.
Well, this is, let me transition to, because I wonder if we're going to have a disagreement on this, because I think net zero is achievable. And keep in mind, I come from a province where we have been tarnished by the environmental movement for our oil sands oil for over a decade. And so I think what we're seeing is that our entrepreneurs are looking at the community out there saying we cannot attract investment because investors, there's a market response, investors want a greener option. We're going to have difficult time attracting workers because this young millennial worker wants to work at a place they can be proud of. We're having a difficult time telling our customers that our product is superior if we don't achieve some of these net zero targets. So I think that there's market signals that are pushing our producers to go in that direction. And looping back to where we began, in how you look at a waste stream or a waste product and find some useful value out of it, you planted that seed with me. And it was quite easy for me to switch into thinking now of carbon dioxide and methane as a feedstock. And there's all amazing number of products that are now being developed, from carbon nanofiber for potential replacement for steel, concrete infused with CO2 that will allow it to capture it, industrial minerals. There's even a vodka called Irco that is made out of CO2.
Okay.
And
I'll have to research that one, yes.
Yeah, true. Well, do some heavy research on that. I'm just thinking, wouldn't it be great to have a Suncor labeled vodka on the shelf, and then that might help to change some hearts and minds. But that's, I guess, the thing is, I don't look at it as an unachievable target. I have great faith in humanity and our ability to be creative and innovative. And so I think that in some ways this offers an opportunity. Now, that being said, I wanted to put that to you because I'm sure I'm not, there may be some things that I'm not thinking about. And I wonder is this a legitimate role for government to say, this is the target we are trying to achieve, and then the entrepreneurs scurry to make it happen? Or is it an illegitimate scurry to make it happen? Or is because for the reasons that we've talked about, it's questionable that we should even be striving for that? How do you see it?
Okay. Well, the issue of CO. Okay. Let me first establish this. I'm an economic geographer. I'm not a climate scientist, but it's hard for me to panic about CO2 when I know that we had ice ages in the past when CO2 concentrations were 10 times higher than they are today. So that's the first thing. And then I would argue in a way that we've come to focus on CO2 because we've addressed most other problems. You go back again in the 60s and the 70s, who cares about CO2? Nobody. They care about things like smog, acid rain, sewage ending up in rivers. We've solved most other environmental problems. So now the one thing that environmental activists can still fret about or be worried about is CO2. Now, the other thing that people in Alberta know, but people in the rest of the country might not, is that most CO2 emissions do not come on the production side of things, even in the oil sector. But when you burn the stuff in your cars, and even when you look at the sort of additional footprint of oil sand oil, it's really not all that much if you look at the whole life cycle and the things being burned in car. But trusting politicians, okay, well, let's look, what have they done? Let's just look at car fuel, for example. They've been pushing ethanol. I mean, ethanol, can you, okay, so I don't know how much time you want to spend on that, but.
Well, let me tell you my base of knowledge about ethanol.
Yes.
Ethanol may make sense as a fuel if you're deriving it from sugarcane. So I think Brazil has a pretty good
Yes.
model for ethanol. It's less clear when it's corn that you're getting more value out than the amount of energy that you're putting in.
Actually, you're not. I think if you discard studies, well, again, okay, I should look at data and rather than who produces the study. But honestly, ethanol, anyone who isn't paid by the ethanol lobby will come to the conclusion that no, you need more energy to produce ethanol than you get out of it. And then I'm sorry, but I don't think you should put food in your car. I just have an ethical issue with that. And so we have politicians who promote things like ethanol. We have politicians who promote things like wind and solar, which would never occur in a market without heavy subsidies, feed-in tariffs, or all the waste that the government producing. And not only do they cost a lot of money, they create energy poverty, energy prices go up. There's no study. If you look at Germany, countries that have gone really gung-ho in terms of trying to switch off fossil fuels, well, they still end up burning low-quality coal. I mean, they should have kept their nuclear power, but there's been this sort of weird anti-nuclear obsession in Germany for decades. But that's kind of another story. But even France kept their nuclear power. There was nuclear energy only began being contested in France in the recent past because they're sort of catching up with what the rest of the world has said. But the French, of all people, who will riot for because there's a new McDonald's opening in town, have been willing to put up with nuclear power for a long time. If you really want to go to net zero, I'm sorry, scrap everything else and build more nuclear power if you cannot have hydroelectric dams. So why should I trust politicians to accelerate that transition when historically you didn't need any political intervention to have energy transitions that were not perfect but created lesser problems than those that existed before? And to me, that's the real measure of progress. And I'm sorry, but how much technical knowledge does Justin Trudeau and his cabinet have about energy? And what kind of track record do they have in terms of opposing pipelines so that we can carry more things in tanker trains? I used to take the GO train in Toronto, and every morning next to my GO train would be this huge, 120 tanks train running by my side, like literally like 10 centimeters from my window. And every time I'm like, something bad will happen one day. Why can't we have pipelines, But yeah, so of course, politicians will have all sorts of goals. At one point, they were like, well, remember also in the 60s and 70s, politicians in North America were trying to switch away from natural gas towards coal because then they were sure North America was going to run out of natural gas. Then fracking comes along and suddenly you switch from coal to natural gas and you actually reduce the CO2 emissions. Not only do you reduce them, but you create real value in the process because now the transition occurs for purely economic reasons. And as you know, natural gas is roughly half of the CO2 emissions of coal. So markets did it. So markets tend to fight waste, promote inefficiency, they reward creative people. Politicians, well, they reward well-connected people, ethanol producers, wind turbine manufacturers. And so, yeah, I'm sorry, but I don't. Okay, I won't be partisan, but let's just say, because I think Aaron O'Toole might not be much better that way. But I don't really. If I can insult all politicians.
Well, there is that sense, though, that we need some sort of authority figure, central planner, to tell us what to do, and then we can all work towards the goal. But everything keeps pointing back in two directions for me in our conversation. You mentioned earlier about one of the big transitions that we had in being able to accommodate a larger population was that we started harvesting things from below the surface of the earth. And it does seem to me maybe that's the thread, is that it's this let's return. When you hear the words of the extreme environmentalists, it's like they want to negate all of that subsurface use, that if coal and oil and natural gas were found underground, they should be left underground, that there's a reason for them underground, that we cannot survive on the surface if we're pulling things from underground to the surface. Therefore, we have to find a way.
Or as though Satan had produced them, whereas, they were, as I tell my students, and I get bad evaluation sometimes. Coal and natural gas and oil are completely natural. It's not humans who created that, and there might be some malevolent entity living in the middle of the earth, but as far as we know, they're completely natural. And it's even worse than that, because, for example, if you look at environmental activists these days, what they like to promote is reverting back to quote unquote natural dye, which means taking agricultural land to grow things like madder, indigo, or saffron, or other types of plant, and extracting coloring matter out of them. Well, no, there's a reason why historically people gave up on that and began to use coal tar residues and then, molecules out of petroleum to do that. All the land that was devoted to growing dyes in places like India and Indonesia and elsewhere could then be used to grow food. And over time, people, when the land was no longer needed, the forests began to grow back. And so, yes, they have this obsession about if it's not grown on the surface of the planet, if it's not alive, it's got to be bad. And if it comes from underground, petroleum is this like unnatural thing. But no, in the end, okay, let me put it this way. Either you believe that a molecule is a molecule is a molecule, or you don't, and you believe that there is some transcendent goodness about living things that grow on the surface of the planet. And if that's what you believe, I'm afraid it's hard to have a rational conversation about these things. But I think, again, if you factor in all the benefits that we've extracted from stuff that came from below the surface of the planet, and if you're willing to consider that there's no perfect solution, but the progress should really be defined by the creation of lesser problems than those that existed before, then it's hard to make a case for leaving stuff underground when all your alternatives will make our life worse, not only in terms of affecting the most vulnerable people in society with higher energy prices, but also, again, killing all sorts of wildlife, raptors, bats. And, after a while, we realize, well, we can't recycle wind turbines. So we've got to bury the stuff. So what have you achieved?
Talk to me a bit about, because you've asserted that coal and oil and natural gas are natural, and it's prompted some harsh reaction from your students. But when you take those components and you process them into plastics, that processing, we're now being told, creates a toxic material. So the federal government has determined that plastics are toxic. And since you've done such a great job of unraveling some of these arguments on other fronts, I'm interested in knowing how you would unravel that argument. Is that a legitimate thing for government to do, to say this is toxic? Therefore, presumably what they want to do is interfere in trade so that you cannot see the cross-border trade in petrochemicals, and presumably substitution, so that we would substitute away from better, maybe put it in quotation marks, more natural products. Presumably that's what they want to achieve as well. But is that the right target? Is that the right goal?
Well, the basic motto of pharmacology is that it's the dosage that makes the poison. If you drink too much water, it will kill you. So yes, everything can be toxic. Another line I like to quote is a line that was often used in the 19th century in disputes in terms of pollution. They said, well, something can be good in an environment and bad in another. So a pig in a barn is a good thing. A pig in your kitchen is a bad thing, but a pig is a pig. And ultimately, what matters about plastic is how we handle them. So if you end up burning them to create electricity and you make sure that nothing bad comes out of the smokestack, well, where's the problem? If you bury them, but your landfill has this sort of big liner of plastic in the ground, is like a rock, or it's like petroleum or coal before. I mean, it's just not a problem. So yes, everything is toxic, but ultimately it's how you handle them. And these days, when we hear those stories about the sea of plastic or the garbage pact and the Pacific Ocean, to the extent that it exists, it doesn't come from advanced economies, because we're wealthy enough and we have political or at least regulatory institutions that are good enough that we don't really stuff in our rivers. They don't find their way to the Pacific Oceans. If you want to look at rivers that are heavily polluted and things that are released, well, I'm sorry, they're in China, they're in Africa, they're in South Asia. Advanced economies are not the problem in that context. Yes, we consume more, But we handle our waste and we manage our waste a lot better than poorer people who, for a number of reasons, simply cannot afford to do it or won't do it or have other priorities. And so again, it's not what you use, it's how you use it. It's ultimately how you dispose of things. And so again, I grew up around Montreal. A lot more people today, a lot more wealth, cleaner air, cleaner water. There's no direct relationship between number of people, wealth, and environmental impact. And plastic, yes, plastic in a plant that generates electricity and that is run according to the most modern production technology is not a problem. Plastic in a river and plastic in the ocean is a problem. But is the issue plastic or how we handle them? So I would argue that the issue then is the way certain people handle plastic, and perhaps a more productive way instead of banning plastic would be to help people in less advanced economies to help them handle their plastic waste better.
Yeah, and I think we're now being forced to have that conversation since China and Malaysia and the Philippines refuse to take our plastics. And so I think we'll probably see, as we were talking about, now you have a waste stream. Can we do something with this? I'm imagining we're likely to see a lot of technological innovation around that.
Yeah.
But talk to me a bit about how you see this international problem that we have, because a lot of the questions that we've been dealing with seem to be an international solution that's required. And that I think there is this sense that our success in the Western industrialized nation comes at the expense of the nations that have not managed to catch up to us yet. And so I'm trying to figure out how you would respond to that argument. It's almost like there's a series of points that have already been predetermined by environmental groups. We can only have so many people on the planet. We can only use so much greenhouse gas emissions. And if you accept those premises...
And we should also, if I may interrupt, we should stick to our bioregion.
Stick to our bioregion.
We should handle our own waste rather than trade them. But again, if you know a little bit of history, you realize that the international trade in waste products has been going on for a very long time. So one thing that people don't realize today is that paper was not always made out of trees. In fact, it's a relatively recent invention in the 1870s. Before that, paper used to be made out of rag and woolen detritus. And there was actually a huge trade in rags and waste in 19th century Europe. A lot of it ended up in the UK because that's how paper was manufactured at the time. And so, a lot of people were complaining, the English are paying more, and so they're stealing all our rags and we can't make paper here. And so, but eventually what solved it? And there's this famous economist, William Stanley Jevons. He's well known historically because he says, well, the United Kingdom is gonna run out of coal and our young people will have to migrate to America or Australia or whatever. And he so believed that the world would run out of paper. Then when he died, people found that he had hidden huge quantities of paper under the floorboard of his house. But then again, people realize, okay, well, what is paper? What do we get out of rags, out of one thing? Well, it's fiber. Where do we find fiber? Well, we have all these trees, and so the paper industry was born in Canada and elsewhere, so that's how it came along. But even before that, you had people used scrap yards for ships today. Yes, they're in Bangladesh and India, and they're not pretty. But in the past, people from Germany and the United States used to send their old ships to Italy or other places where labor costs would really make the difference. And so you've had ship scrap yards for a long time. There was no electronic waste in the past, but there was a huge, I don't, if this is too much history, stop me, but historically, the first environmental laws in the United States really came in the American South in the 1840s, and the product was completely natural. The horrible product was cotton seed. So people would grow a lot of cotton. The fiber was very valuable, but the seed has the natural pesticide in it, and it would kill everything that would eat it except mature cows or mature ruminants who could sort of digest the stuff. And so what people didn't know what to do with their old cotton seed, it would dump them in rivers, but then the natural insecticide in those things would leach out of the seeds and kill all the fishes nearby. And then if they tried to burn it, well, there was a lot of oil in those cotton seeds, and so the fire would get out of control and might, burn barns and what have you. But eventually people found hundreds of uses to make out of this. The oil was extracted. Before olive oil became affordable, people would use that. Crisco, a lot of people don't know that Crisco actually came from crystallized cottonseed oil. Today it's made out of soybeans, but it was a way to turn the waste into something useful. Well, there was a huge trade in cottonseed at one point. The US could not absorb the whole cottonseed production, so a lot of it was actually shipped in Western Europe, in places like Denmark and the Netherlands, where you could feed them to dairy cows. And so you could solve a problem in the United States, waste disposal, provide better nutrition in Europe because the price of dairy products came down as a result of having this cheap cottonseed from the United States being shipped to Europe. Again, problem in the US, solution in Europe, people found monies, there was this sort of big trade that was developed. And so the point I'm trying to make is that we've had this trade in quote unquote waste products for a very long time. Environmentalists don't like that because they operate on this notion that we should live locally, we should handle our waste locally. But often the most sensible way to create wealth and reduce environmental problems is to have more long-distance trade. So that's the first thing that I would say. You should not oppose people buying our waste if they're willing to do it and if they find value in that. It might not be pretty. We might not want to have the life that they have in some of the least developed parts of China or India, but we should not deny these people the possibility of some cheap inputs out of which they can make a better living. At least that's the first thing I would say. And the solution eventually is not to kill that trade, but to make sure that better technologies are developed that can handle the waste more cleanly and can create value out of it more efficiently. So we should not have this, again, I'm not making this up. There's plenty of history that shows that there was this huge international trade in waste for good practical reasons in the past. The economy and the environment benefited from this sort of spontaneous emergence of trading networks. So we should not be opposed to that. And then, though, the reason why environmentalists like CO2 emission is that they say, well, it's a global problem. Therefore, it comes as a local solution. The planet doesn't care if there's petroleum products are burned in Alberta, or they're burned in China, or they're burned in the UK. You can talk to more qualified people than me on that, but that's the big problem.
Well, let me finish up by sort of springboarding off of that, because I think that there has been this notion that because there's inequity, we have to slow down what we are doing in industrialized countries while the others get a chance to catch up, which is part of the reason why we don't have consistent CO2 emissions policies from one region to another, and why we don't hold certain jurisdictions to the same standard as those of us who have the head start. And I'm wondering about that type of approach. Would there be any value in having those economies that have developed faster slow down so that everyone can catch up, so we can deal with some of the equity issues?
Okay, what I would say is that you go back a few thousand years, everybody was poor. So wealth needs to be created. It's not stolen magically from one part of the world and then moved to another. You might say, well, Western Europe got rich because of colonialism. How do you get rich? By stealing from poor people? It's kind of never been proven. No, Western Europe got rich because of technology, because people got out of subsistence farming, educated, and they began creating other problems. We need to do the exact same thing with less advanced economies. We need to get people out of subsistence farming. We need to move them into cities. We need to allow those people's kids to become educated and to contribute to the global division of labors. More brain, more technologies, more possible combination, more solutions. The solution in the long run is to integrate people from less advanced economies into the global division of labor, lift them out of poverty, and make sure that their smartest people will contribute to new solutions that will turn problems into opportunities and into solutions. That's the only way to achieve both economic development, lift people out of poverty, and ultimately reduce our environment. So people are an asset, they're not a liability. People are not just mouths to feed, they're also brains to think of new solutions and hands to work.
That's a great note to end on. We started off talking about geography, moved to economics, spent a lot of time in history, ended up, I think, at politics. So I can see why you challenge your students so much. Yeah. It's been such a pleasure talking with you today.
Anytime.
That is Pierre Desrochers. He is Associate Professor of Geography at the University of Toronto and also a Senior Fellow at the Fraser Institute. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you like what you heard, be sure to subscribe on YouTube and wherever you stream your podcasts. And to stream old episodes, learn more about the show, and where to subscribe and submit your questions for future guests, visit fraserforum.org.